Today I'm going to be talking through these two questions, which is what data do users need and how do you show it to them? And as my job title may indicate, I'm going to be approaching this from a research perspective. First of all, I want to go through a bit of a background case study, so one that we see an awful lot in the public and private sector, and then I'll talk about some of the research methods that we use when we get given a problem like this. So a client has a system which brings together different data and displays it to users in lots of different ways. But they've noticed a few problems. It's become difficult to maintain, so maybe the people who built it have now left, which means that the data is now getting out of date, and it's also not adapted and changed with users' needs. Potentially because of what it's been built on, it may be expensive due to licensing costs. And because the data is getting out of date, there's also potential costly errors from a service perspective, where people's documents that they're creating has inaccurate data within it. And then quite often when we're given this sort of client problem too, the products themselves are failing accessibility audits because accessibility wasn't in their mind when they were first developing the interface. And this means that we get given this aim, which is to replace legacy technology with a maintainable and accessible system. And that makes complete sense. Like, people come to us, they think what they need is some new shiny interface for this product that they've got. But when we're given a problem like this, actually from a research perspective, one of the things that we want to understand a bit more is actually where does this system fit within their daily lives? So taking a step back and doing stuff like interviews with people, observations, so you go and spend time with them and find out about their lives and stuff like that, means that then we can start to think beyond just the legacy system, but actually how can we build something that's useful for them? And the next couple of slides are a very typical user story. So I've gone through a few of the different studies that I've done and tried to create the standard user story that we've seen in this setting. So our user's role requires them to use data. They're having to present that data in lots of different formats. Maybe they're having to make policy briefs, slide decks, things like that. They're also having to gather that data from multiple different systems because there's no one place where they can get the information that they require. And this is just that one point where the legacy technology fits in with their daily lives, because that's just one of the systems that they're using. They're also often having to go to like internal spreadsheets or external systems, stuff like that, to try and get the information that they require. And I don't want to generalize all users within this, because quite often when we speak to people, they've got very different levels of data confidence. We've got some users who really love a giant spreadsheet and they love looking through huge pages of numbers. But also within this setting, when we're talking to people, you've got those who are using the same system, but they're feeling a bit less confident with data interpretation. So maybe they've had a role for 5 years where they've been looking at just one data set. All of a sudden their role shifts and they're now having to look at something like finances, so they need some extra help in interpreting the significance of that data. Also, as I'm sure you can imagine, you've got multiple different systems, they're getting data at different points, which means it doesn't match up, so people aren't sure where to go to get accurate information. And as I'm sure you can appreciate, every time we get a problem like this, one of the main pain points our users have is that it's incredibly time-consuming. So obviously there's loads of different problems and pain points that we came up with when we were chatting to people. But when we wanted to try and understand what data do our users actually need, one of the things that we need to understand is more about the sort of tasks that people are doing. And so what are they using the data for? And one of my absolute favorite questions to ask anyone is, what's your role? What does it involve? What are some things you do? And so in this sense, what data do you use? Because then we can start mapping stuff out onto a lucid board. And anyone who's ever worked with researchers or designers will know that we really love mapping stuff out onto a lucid board. So this is what we do. We ask someone, what task do you do? They then say, I write a policy brief. And then you go, okay, cool. What information do you include in that policy brief? What data do you include in it? What systems do you go to? And those sort of things, and you start to build a picture of their lives. We also collect lots of documents, so asking people to send us the different sort of information that they're putting together, the hundreds of finance tables that they're having to put together and things like that. Because again, that helps us really understand what people are doing in their roles. Obviously, we need to go back to our legacy technology. That's the thing that the client wants us to try and replace. So this is one of the exercises that we've done on an even larger lucid board, which is with the first frame, we started mapping out what data people were actually using. The second, third, and fourth one was all the data on the legacy system that we're trying to replace. And what we could start to do then is start scrapping some of the information that was in there, saying this isn't relevant, why are we going to bother lifting this to the new product? But also start saying, if we're going to build something that's useful for people, and there's data in this product that there's not data in the current product that they need, then we need to start thinking about places where we can get that, so that then we're actually building something that's meeting their needs, not just a new shiny interface. So we've now done all that background work, we've understood the data at this stage in the project, but we now want to try and understand how should we be showing it to them. And my secret passion, it's not a secret passion, I tell everybody this, but my actual passion in research is all about research methods and all the different ones that you can use. So I've already spoken about two, but I'm about to show you my actual, probably favorite method, which is co-design. I think it's brilliant, it's such a great method, but fundamentally that's because it's all about designing with and not just for your users. And I think it's brilliant because they're just kind of doing the hard work for us. They're creating the product that's going to meet their own user needs. And also they're creating the wireframes for us, which means it leads to faster prototyping. It's also just a really fun method to use if you're in this sort of project. So this is what we've done when we've reached this stage, is thinking, all right, let's get users to create this product for us. And all that hard work that we did before of trying to understand what data they need then feeds into exercises such as this, where we say to them, can you now group this together for us? And the output of this is really useful because, as you can see, we've started with grouping it together. You name that page, it becomes the pages then of your product. So you've got an overview page and things like that, which then helps us start thinking about how we're going to design this thing. But also by getting them to group the data together, we're going to improve the overall navigation of the system because it's going to come more naturally to them because they've created the way that they want to see stuff being put together. But it's not just about grouping the data. Co-design is also about creating those initial pages with people. And I think it must be quite intimidating if you don't have a background in design, or sometimes our users say, oh, I'm not very creative and things like that, to then come along and be like, hey, design a page for us. So we try to give people lots of different options of how they can do it, which again, if you're using this method, I would highly encourage not to just say, come use a lucid board, but instead say stuff like we gave people a pen and paper, or they could describe to us what their vision was and we could make it for them. Or you can do something like this, where we gave them this design toolbox where they could just drag and drop stuff and create the page themselves. So the output is then a wireframe, which we can then turn into our very first prototype. If we look back at that original problem, one of the things that people were needing to do was collate data together. And so we started to reach that point in here. This was all about what this co-design session, that was the fundamental aim here, was how do we collate information together in a way that's useful for them. So then when you're working in a public sector project, if you've ever done that, you then start using the government patterns, a bit like the ones you may see on filling out your taxes or something like that. We took the wireframes and we created then the collation of data. So they could go here and they could get the information that they required, which was great because we got feedback where people were like, oh yeah, I really like the way you can navigate it, I really like the look of it and stuff like that. And then they got to a particular page that looks something like this. And you get really brutally honest people who are my favorite people in research sessions, to be honest, who turn around and say, I really don't like that. I don't like what you've done. I don't like your designs. And this was actually, it was really positive for us in one way, because what it showed us was that we were meeting that initial need of collating data, but the need that we weren't meeting was one that we didn't quite understand yet, which was about interpreting data. So not just about what does the page look like, but how are we showing that data to people? And so we went back to co-design to go and try and understand a bit more about how people would want to see this information on the page. And this is the sort of output you get from those. Again, you get a lot of RAG rating, so red, amber, green, indicating the significance of a figure with colour. And the reason for this was that they could really quickly look at that page. We knew they didn't have much time. We knew that they wanted to interpret the data quickly. They could see whether something was getting better over time. And then the same situation with having graphs as well. You can quickly see the trends through time. And again, we got to this stage where we're like, this is great, like we know how we should be displaying this data to people. But then as a product team, we were thinking, all right, but if we show this, then we really, really need to consider the ethics of how we're displaying this data. Because we've got kind of a role in research and design, which is like helping people to understand that information. And we reached this ethical dilemma where our users had told us that their real need was to quickly and easily interpret the data. And then they'd shown us that they wanted RAG ratings, that this helps them achieve that aim. But we were then like, well, if we do that, we're then influencing their decisions. And our role as a researcher and designer isn't to influence people's decisions, it's to help them to try and interpret data. So we took a step back and said, well, you know, we could be using AI, we're working with people in data analysis and stuff like that for them to help us know whether these figures are significant, you know, if a red figure is going to be something that's bad, those sort of things. But actually we then also wanted to understand, well, what else can we be doing to be building an ethical product for people? And so we went back to our users and we were like, right, if you see a red number, what do you do with that? And I think this is potentially one of my favorite quotes that I've got in one of these sessions, which is that context is key. It's all about context. So for them, what we needed to do to build a product that was going to be useful was not just show something's got worse through time, but to also give them the information that then they could contextualize that data and say, well, maybe this company has been going through a difficult patch because they've got a high turnover in their board or something like that. That provides the context needed to understand why this is happening. Or with the Department for Education case, we were thinking about what data could you be putting next to each other so that then when someone sees this figure, they can go, okay, well, there's been a different cohort of children, there's this age range, all those bits of information that provide the context that means that what you're building is more useful and also more ethical. Those were my main messages about itself. But I guess one of the questions as a researcher that we get asked all the time is, well, what's the point? Like, what are the benefits of using research and design in this situation? Which I think is also a fair question because there are designs and patterns out there that you could be using. But hopefully the next slide will convince you of a few reasons why it's worth it. One of them is that you are saving time because your users are now getting the data that they need in one place. They're not having to go to all those different places. And this means that they're being able to do their tasks much faster too. You're also increasing accessibility because when something is built that people can't use, then it's a smaller user group who are going to be using a product, all those sort of things. And it's not just thinking about accessibility from the perspective of using a screen reader or something like that. There's also like making sure that the data and the way it's represented is accessible too. They're going to be saving money by getting this right because it's going to reduce licensing costs because you're going to have your own system to be running. And also reducing those costly errors that we spoke about right at the beginning where people are now using correct data in the outputs that they're creating. And then finally, we've also got the environmental benefit of this. In that, again, user story that I was talking about, I'm not over-exaggerating when I've said I spoke to users who each time they do a particular task, like each time they're writing a brief, they have to go to 20 systems to download the same data every single time. And that does have an environmental impact because they're having to download and store all of that data too. So again, having a system that you've built which is meeting the needs of people in one place, having the figures that they require in that system is reducing how much data they're having to download. Final message then is if you're ever given a project like this where you're having to create a new interface or a new product surrounding data, is to take a step back, to do some research, do some design so that then you can create something that's usable and useful for your users. Thank you very much.